and welcome to Massive Crit. I'm massively behind in my hobby schedule and it needs to get sorted, so I'm going to go against my better judgment and work towards deadlines so I can get as much done in the smallest amount of time possible, starting with the Gallowdark. That's a lot of terrain and I'm no good with deadlines. I'm a firm believer in the better late than never philosophy. I need a plan, and the plan is to build, prep and spray on the first day, dry brush everything on the second day and pick out any details on the third day. On the fourth day, I rest. I start by taking a look at the book where it advises to number the sections using the key provided to make assembly faster for games. I did take this advice and painted the numbers on the bottom of each section before I sprayed. In hindsight, I would recommend to do this after you spray because some of them I had to redo after undercoating. To help organise myself, I separate the different sprues into 3 piles in an attempt to make the assembly faster. This didn't help too much because I found different parts for the same section spread out over different sprues, but what can you do? I tried. After removing the necessary parts, I remove the mould lines and the sprue tags as quickly as I can, not being too concerned if I take a chunk out of the model because it's terrain at the end of the day. It won't be noticed once painted. I do follow the instructions as closely as I can except for the hatchways. The instructions say not to glue them into place, but then they just fall off. I use a very small amount of plastic cement to glue them into place, being careful not to use too much and accidentally gluing the doors shut. But looking back, perhaps super glue would have been a better option because one of the doors was a little stiff once dry, but I soon managed to get it loose again, so no biggie. I then use masking tape to cover all the holes and connections in an attempt to reduce the amount of sanding time this terrain is notorious for needing. But this proved to be a waste of time in the end because I found a much quicker and easier solution than sanding, but more on that later. This was all I managed to get done for the first day because I started a little late and the sun's gone down, and I'll just have to wait for the sunlight in the morning. So it's the start of day 2 out of 3. It's around 8 AM in the morning and bollocks. So yeah, it just turns out that one can of spray is insufficient to spray the entire set, so I need to go and get some more. Enter the Singaporean travel montage. So, another disaster. Bliss Minis doesn't have the Vallejo black spray in, and the only other place that could is Hammer House, and that opens at 3, so I'm going to go to Hammer House to see if I can pick it up there. Now I finally have everything sprayed. I remove the masking tape and play around fitting the pieces together, and it's just too tight. That's what she said. I want to get the terrain finished as soon as possible, so filing down the connections for days is just not an option. Instead, I cut 2 of the 3 connections away. The pillars have a little clip on the bottom, so I decided to cut away the bottom and middle connection, believing that one tight connection will do the job. And it did. The connection was so much easier to put together and take out, but after playing around a little more, I discovered that when the cap is on top of the pillar, the terrain didn't sit flat and had some sort of kink in it. This was concerning because the problem will only become more pronounced from having the whole board's worth of terrain set up altogether. So after a bit of thought, the problem seemed to be this little peg on top of the last remaining connector, which sits under the cap on top of the pillar. When the cap was on, the peg seemed to force the wall up a couple of degrees. But with the peg removed, the problem was sorted. Butchering the connection seemed to work for me so far, so I tried something similar with the pillars, using this AK mixing tool to remove the cap, and that's when it hit me. If I can just remove the cap easily enough with this mixing tool, do I need to change anything? The answer was definitely no. I'm on day 2 of 3 after all, so I don't have time to mess about, so I'll just keep this tool handy for this kill zone. I don't use it for anything else, so sweet. Cutting off the connections turned into a 20 to 30 minute job as opposed to however long it takes to sand them down, so all in all I'm pretty happy with the amount of time this step saved me. I should mention though that I'm being as careful as I can not to make the cut too close to the border to reduce the risk of gaps appearing. I'm just leaving a couple of millimeters at the bottom to reduce this risk. I don't want any sunlight shining through there. The last thing I managed on day 2, thanks to the primer fiasco, was to use Vallejo Black on all the areas the masking tape covered. I used Vallejo Black because I used the black spray, so I was thinking if I used the same brand I could get a finish as close as I could to the black spray, but it's inevitably a little different. It's now day 3 and I'm only just starting to get painting. I'm a day behind schedule, I've got a lot to catch up on. I'm only really trying to get like a tabletop standard, but am I going to get it all done in one day? Let's find out. I start by slapping down some typhus corrosion, which is a technical paint used to give a corroded texture when dry, believe it or not. So I sponge it about the place, trying to aim for places where it will look the most natural, yet trying to finish as fast as possible. The Gallowdark has been drifting in and out of the warp for millions of years, so I want the paint job to look old and worn to better represent this drifting hulk. Next, I use Tinny Tin by Vallejo, but you could just use Brass Scorpion as a GW alternative if you wish, which is similar, not quite the same, but similar. I'm using a heavy dry brush of this, just leaving the black undercoat in the recesses. I don't want to use any washes on the terrain because firstly, that is too damn expensive to use on terrain, and secondly, I don't have the time. The Tinny Tin will give more depth to the end result rather than just dry brushing the silver over the black, which is much cheaper than using washes in my opinion. On the flat areas of the terrain, like the pillars and caps, I'm using an old brush to dab the paint on as if I'm using a sponge, again to give an old unkept look. Now I break out the Incubi Darkness and begin dabbing it straight out of the pot in all the areas as shown on the box art, but this took way too much time. It took absolutely ages, so after I finished one wall segment this way, I switched up, concentrating on the raised areas only with the Incubi Darkness. The process was still long, but this did help cut the time down and helped break up the colours, selling the worn out look even more, which I do prefer. Like when I compare both of them, I prefer the quick way anyway, so win-win. Yep, it's now day 4. I probably would have got everything finished if I stayed up until 12, and probably would have been enough time, but I didn't. I'd had enough painting, so I just didn't. What can I say? I'll probably still keep the thumbnail that I've got in mind though, just so I can clickbait you all in. Now I'm applying some riser rust to a few select areas using the same techniques previously. Yeah, it is an out of production paint, but you can just use any orange you fancy, like Fire Dragon Bright or whatever. It doesn't have to be a dry paint. I don't want to overdo it with the paint, so I'm not dry brushing the whole thing. I'm just doing my best to pick out some areas, specifically where I've used typhus corrosion or generally any part that I want metallic in the next stage. Next, I use Trash Metal by Scale 75, I think, because the name just seemed to represent what I'm looking to achieve with the terrain, but any silver will do, I think. Like a GW alternative would be something like Iron Breaker or something like that. I'm being a little lighter with my dry brush compared to when I was dry brushing the tinny tin, because I don't want to obscure too much the previous layers while still maintaining a highlight effect. And this is the final sort of stage of the base colour. So after this I just want to add a tiny bit of detail and we're done. So for the final stage I place some masking tape over the top panel of the hatchways, and using Avalanche Sunset pretty much straight out of the tub I dab it on to create some hazard stripes. Note that I'm only doing this on top of the walls that have hatchways, so when I finally get around to filming some battle reports, the hatchways will be obvious next to the other walls. I would have liked to paint a bit more detail, but the project had already taken too long, so I'll just leave it here. Perhaps in the future I'll add some red-green contrast to some of the screens and some iron oxide to the pipes, but I'm pretty happy with the end result nonetheless. Time for the big reveal. So there we have it, painting the entire Gallowdark in just 3 days. And ignoring the narrative terrain, that certainly helped. But yes, 3 days to paint the entire box set. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoy the tunes, I'll leave a link for Rush's YouTube channel in the description down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, may you always crit master.